Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a beautiful crowd, wonderful speaker this evening. Several significant things going on. I hope everybody can hear me clearly. If you can't, just let me know. Just give a holler. All right. Firstly, we're very grateful. I think all of us, not just every Jew, but every decent human being is grateful for the news yesterday. As you well know, how can you not know? There was a hostage situation at a synagogue in Texas. 4 people were taken hostage, including the rabbi. And thank God they were all released. Nevertheless, it still reminds us that we have a long way to go in fighting hatred, in fighting bigotry, and the ugly menace of hatred still remains with us till this very day. Just admitting a few more people. Okay. So that's one thing we're grateful for. Another thing I want to mention, and by the way, on Tony Carnes' website, he put on that, as you well know, most of you I'm sure know, that it's also Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat and Martin Luther King Day, the same day, starts the same night and the same day. So 2022 is off to a good start. I don't believe that it's really a coincidence, and I'll tell you why. Tu B'Shvat, which is the 15th of Shvat, is the new year or birthday for trees and planting. And it's often celebrated by eating specific fruits and, of course, by planting trees. Trees, as you know, are symbolic of everything Dr. King represented. A wise person once said about planting a tree, he said, the true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. That was said by Nelson Henderson. And Dr. King fit that description very well. He fought for equal treatment of all human beings. And while he did not see immediate results to everything he fought for during his lifetime, lots of the progress we see here in the United States in terms of equality is in great part related to the seeds this visionary planted. And for this reason, it's fitting that this very evening on Tu B'Shvat, we reflect on a man who symbolizes what this holiday is all about. And I thought, given the religious nature of the MLK holiday this year, we have a great, great luminary with us. We're privileged to have him, Tony Carnes, who is the founder and editor of A Journey Through New York City Religions. And I urge you to take a look at it online. There was an article last year, just about a year ago, about our online activities. And that's one of the great things about the New York City, A Journey Through New York City Religions, just one of many, many, many great things about it. But it's an award-winning, they have an award-winning magazine, produces about 150 features per year on religion in New York City. Over 8 years of publication, A Journey has been visited by over 50 million people. I believe now they're up to 55 million viewers, which is a tremendous thing. So that's we'll give you all the opportunity after Tony Carnes talks to us. You'll have an opportunity. If you feel free to put stuff on the chat in the meantime, and we could acknowledge some things you wrote, or if you have questions, feel free to put it on the chat, and we'll certainly, I think Tony will address it. So right now, it is my privilege to introduce to you the one of the great editors of today, Tony Carnes. Go right ahead.
Well, thank you for that over-the-top introduction. I appreciate it, and I certainly appreciate being with your assembly here this evening. I'm going to try to touch on some things about Martin Luther King and our city that maybe you don't know about. We know a lot about the icon of Martin Luther King, but I wanted to see if we can't find a few things that maybe not everyone knows. And so be a little bit more interesting and a little bit different take. I'm going to try to do 4 things tonight. And by the way, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'm not the Mr. Expert on Martin Luther King, but we all can contribute what we know about him and the civil rights movement and also our city. I'm really going to talk about what I call the revelations of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And tonight I want to do 4 things about Reverend King that you might not know, and might be some interesting new angles on his work. First, I want to reveal for you the close connection that Reverend King had with Israel, the Jewish community, and with Brooklyn and Queens. Second, I want to reveal a relatively unnoticed root of the civil rights movement in the Law of Moses. And third, I'd like to, the third revelation will be how Dr. King hoped to build both the African and white American consciences, and by doing that, building a renewed America. And then fourth, I ask you to imagine how this might apply to your own thinking and life. First, I'd like to notice that we do know that Reverend King was unabashedly connected to Israel, the American Jewish community, Brooklyn, and Queens. So let me talk about those connections. And some of them are rather obvious. We know them, but I'll try to give a few tidbits that are off the beaten track. First, as our rabbi has mentioned, we should all take a moment to be thankful that the hostages in the synagogue near Dallas, Texas, were escaped unharmed. That's a good news to start the year at, and we should be thankful that Jews should have the right to exist, worship, to talk about God without fear of suppression and death. And so today, yesterday, and today, we can celebrate that we're emphasizing those values by this success. In 1967, Reverend Martin Luther King also faced had to deal with courage and give open support to Jews, and particularly to Israel, in the face of a potentially genocidal attack by the Arab nations around it. The Arab nations were plotting to wipe out Israel, but they failed. And King also knew that the Jews of his day were supporting him and the African Americans in their quest for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as you know, their requests were often met with fire hoses and snarling dogs and threats of death and fire bombings that hoped to kill off the civil rights movement, but they failed too. As we shall see, the roots of Reverend King's strategy for the civil rights movement and for the emancipation of Americans out of racism and self-degradation goes back to ancient Israel. We know well the identification of African Americans with the story of the Exodus, of Jews leaving slavery, proceeding to receive the 10 Commandments, the 10 words, and entering the Promised Land. This is fairly well known. But certain aspects of the 10 Commandments were used by King to fashion his civil rights methods. And they were elements that were deeply embedded in the African American community that he could appeal to. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Now, Reverend King saw that the threat to Israel was an existential threat and wanted to support the nation. He also wanted to acquaint the African American community more with Israel. So that's why in 1966, he reached out to Reverend Sandy Day of the Cornerstone Baptist Church, which, by the way, is a church that exists in Bed-Stuy today. And they planned a pilgrimage to Israel in which they would preach from the Mount of Olives in Jordan and on the Sea of Galilee in Israel. They expected they would involve over 5,000 people. And when they announced it in 1967, on May 16th, they had hundreds of people sign up to go on this pilgrimage. But two important pastors, I think, just for us to know, that most people know King as the Southern Civil Rights leader and his relationship to people in Manhattan. But Reverend King had deep roots with the rest of the city. And since we are talking in a synagogue that's in Brooklyn, I certainly want us to remember that he had deep roots in Brooklyn, particularly through two churches, the Concord Avenue Baptist Church, which was in Bed-Stuy, pastored by Reverend Gardner Taylor. This was a 10,500 person church, and it still exists. And Gardner Taylor was proclaimed by many, many Americans, white and black, as maybe one of the best preachers in the United States. There was also another preacher that Martin Luther King considered one of the best in the United States, and that was Reverend Day, who he was arranging this trip to go to Israel with. And Reverend Sandy Ray, and Sandy Ray is at Cornerstone Baptist Church. Cornerstone is also in Bed-Stuy. Both of these churches moved into buildings that used to be synagogues. And by the way, we're now seeing Bed-Stuy, some churches are reverting back to become synagogues. So we have this cycle of movement in the city that's so interesting and reflects the different peoples coming in and out of the city. He was a long-term friend of Sandy Ray in Bed-Stuy. They were roommates in college together. They did a lot of things together, and Sandy Ray presided over Martin Luther King's mother's funeral. And when Martin Luther King was stabbed in Manhattan, Harlem, Manhattan, by a deranged woman who wanted to kill him, and he barely escaped with a sliver of the knife that went in, just barely missed his heart. He decided he'd leave Manhattan and come to Brooklyn and spend his recovery period with Reverend Ray. Also, just one other little note about his Queens relationship. He used to live for a very short while near where I live. He was a student minister in East Elmhurst, New York. And I suspect you don't know that King goes all the way back to 1950, and he was a student minister here, and evidently not necessarily a very good one. He ministered at First Baptist Church of East Elmhurst, and that minister was a friend of the family, and evidently the father thought that the young Martin Luther King was sort of coasting and gliding through things, not very serious about his studies, was known for being a really good pool shark. In other words, he probably was, and he was going to school up here, not in the South. He probably was like many pastors' kids or rabbis' kids. He's pushing back and trying to separate himself, but along the way, he was really just coasting through. So if you look at his report on his student ministership, his internship in East Elmhurst, New York, it is really, the pastor there really let King have it. He said he was just a so-so preacher. He was full of himself. He thought he was better than anyone else. He couldn't get the cooperation with anybody. He went on and on and on. I feel sorry for a king that his father's friend decided to really pour it on him, but it did some good. And soon after that, he met his wife-to-be, and as they say, the rest is history. Now, King and Ray had this elaborate plan that they were going to assemble 5,000 people into Israel, and they were going to do that in the summer of 1967. Well, as you know, the Six-Day War happened in June of 1967. The June War, I don't think I have to explain its importance, but for those that don't follow this so much, it was a hugely important war. Basically, all the Arab countries around Israel decided they were going to get rid of Israel. They started a blockade of the Suez Canal and were preparing to attack, but Israel beat them to the punch, and their planes basically destroyed the Arab air forces. And in 6 days, they had beaten all the Arab nations around them. And they had acquired a lot of land, and they acquired Jerusalem. This is where we get, from the 1967 war, we get the understanding of the Israelis as a superhero, super warriors. And certainly they did an incredible job against huge odds. But of course, many of the more radical Arabs didn't like this and started criticizing King for supporting Israel. So King and Ray decide that if they went into Israel with the trip, it'd be right after the war. Everybody would be, constantly looking for things to criticize, and they decided to cancel it. So he called LL Airlines in August of 1967 and says, we can't fly, we can't do the trip, but we'd like to think about doing it in 1968. King felt like he needed to make a statement about Israel. Israel, he said, he wrote to a New York City Jewish leader. He wrote a letter to make his views known. And in this letter, he said, Israel's right to exist as a state is incontestable. That support is really strong support. And it met the King to put down his marker that he supported Israel's right to exist. But of course, this made him very unpopular in some circles, and unpopularity that continues to stay in many of the Palestinian community. Well, as you know, King never got to Israel. He never was able to make that hope for a trip. He was assassinated in April 4th, 1968. But notice that up to that moment, his relationship to the Jewish community was extensive. And we'll talk about Abraham Herschel in a moment, who was a theologian that he was on the same page with. And that he had a deep roots in New York, not only Manhattan, but the boroughs, and in particular in Brooklyn. So I think many people overlook these important roots of Martin Luther King. He learned how to preach in New York. Of course, he learned from his dad too, who was a preacher, but he came up here to be put to test. And in fact, a couple of churches offered him a position, but he decided to go south. Now, what did Reverend King get from ancient Israel that maybe we haven't noticed too much before? Well, of course, there are many things, as I stated. He got the story, as all African Americans do, of the exodus from slavery to the promised land. But there was something else that he got, a theme that he got out of the Bible, that both he and his very good friend, Abraham Herschel, Heschel, that is the importance of conscience and building conscience for building a community, building a nation. Now, it worked sort of like this. And by the way, if you want to know who, if you don't know who Abraham Heschel is, you can see him right behind Rabbi Segal, there over his right shoulder, the guy with the white hair and the white beard. He also marched with Reverend King, and he was a notable New York theologian at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Jewish Theological, and and was considered one of the best religious thinkers in the United States. Well, it sort of worked this way. In the 1950s, King preached on the hiddenness of God. He said, why does, in all the catastrophe we've been through, why does God keep himself hidden? Why does he seem so distant? Why don't we hear his voice? Why does he do this? You remember the prophet Isaiah, in a famous passage in chapter 45, said, God, why do you self-hide yourself? In other words, at some point, the Bible portrays that God hides himself. Sometimes it's in mercy, sometimes it's in justice, sometimes it's the emphasis that you need to be listening more. Now, the question then is, well, when will God reveal himself? And how does he do it? How will he reveal himself to us here on earth? And Reverend King came back to this topic several times, the same topic during the Civil Rights Movement. Now, his first pastorate outside of seminary was in Montgomery, Alabama. And he said, even in Montgomery, Alabama, God seems far away. So how is God going to become known as a local guy in Montgomery, Alabama? Someone nearby who cares for the African-American community and those outside the community? Well, King's answer was this, and he got this by listening to his friend Abraham Heschel, or at least that emphasized what he was thinking. Is how we know that how God is revealed is when the conscience of a person is revealed. That is, when somebody's conscience just pricked or moved, and you say, I just don't feel right about this. At that moment, you know that something deeper is going on, that something that shows that humans have sort of an extra hidden dimension about themselves that goes beyond, the presentation they make to people, beyond the surface, that there's something deep about a human being. African Americans call this soul. Soul is that part of the person that's deep, and that is the place where the conscience and consciousness, motivation and hope reside, and it comes welling out, and it's not visible before. So when people bring these things out, you start to know there's a bigger dimension to reality. And this dimension seems to indicate that there's something bigger than ourselves. There's some deepness about people that represents the deepness of the universe. Humans are not only actors and consumers. In the 1950s, in Martin Luther King's, when he was starting the Civil Rights Movement, was the age of the organization men. Everybody would fit the organization and say the organization language and be sort of part of the corporate bureaucracy. It was the age of advertising and TV commercials. All of these things were fairly surface, but what was 26-second video bits. Of course, now we're down to 124 characters in a tweet, or I guess they upped it to 200 some odd. But there's more to a human being than the bits and drabs of the external. There's something deep about them. So it's not only what a person does that counts, but how his heart is involved in the doing. And when you find somebody's heart in the doing, you start to see that God is making himself known there. Now, King observed this firsthand, how people would come out with something deep, and all of a sudden it would say, wow, there's something about this person I never expected. Now, the problem is, according to King and Heschel, is that this deep hiddenness had sort of gotten covered up. People were looking at the surface things. They were forgetting about God in secularization, but they were also forgetting about this deepness of themselves. Now, of course, not everyone did this, and there were different ways of handling the modern world. But they felt like on the modern world that the conscience had sort of taken a back seat and was no longer the driver in the public sphere. And as the conscience receded on the public sphere, so did the awareness of God. These were religious men, and they felt like that these two things, your sense of self and the sense of God, were disconnected to each other. One met the other. Now, so the third thing they wanted to do is, how can the conscience of Americans be revealed by the civil rights movement? The civil rights movement was a conscience building exercise. Well, this was a lot of this thinking was hashed out when Abraham Heschel and Martin Luther King met first on January 14th, 1963, at a meeting on race and religion. They had not met before. And at that meeting, Heschel told King this: God has been exiled from our world. Our task is to bring God back into the world. And King said, I agree. How do we do this? Heschel asked. Well, we do this, he proposed, by bringing the conscience back into public view. The conscience of people being an important aspect of the public square. And he proceeded to outline 6 ways that people deal with conscience, and 6 ways they either hide their conscience, they forget about their conscience, try to live out, not feel guilty about their conscience, or actually to bring it out and wrestle with it. And Martin Luther King and Abraham Heschel said, yes, we want to bring out people's conscience and have them wrestle with it. But how can we do that, particularly when we don't agree? How do we do that? And there were 2 revelations of conscience they worked on in the civil rights movement. 2 revelations of conscience. That is, that sense of what's right and wrong. The first one was for African Americans. It said African Americans need to believe that they count for something. Martin Luther King found that many African Americans in the South and elsewhere felt degraded and devalued, and it sort of crept into their heart, so they sort of felt bad about themselves. There was a lot of anger in that. There's a lot of feeling of failure. The first psychoanalysis of an African American took place before Martin Luther King's day. But one thing they found was that there's deep down, there's this sense of not fitting, not being good enough, and anger that are not recognizing to be good enough. And what King felt like they had to do was to make African Americans realize their conscience, their heart, shows that God really has put some dignity inside them, has made them special to God. That if they can be the conscience, the right and wrong, and speak about what's right and wrong in the community, they can actually play a very important role. The key for King, he put it this way: we need to overcome the self-doubt that was instilled by slavery and discrimination and being downtrodden. So the first thing we need to do is to revive the conscience of the Southern African African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama. We need for them to say, I actually have a right to say what's right and wrong. I do have a right, and it's God-given right. Civil rights movement.
By the way, Tony, I'm sorry to interrupt. Maybe another minute. Maybe we want to pause for some questions. I'm sure people might have some questions.
So let me go to so the second one is they wanted the white Americans, the ones that opposed them, the racists. How could they find their conscience and actually say, oh, well, wait a moment, maybe what we're doing is wrong. They decided the method would be to use peaceful, loving, nonviolent disobedience to the unconstitutional rules of discrimination. They thought by doing things, people would react against them, like whites would spit on them or yell at them. As long as African Americans didn't do the same thing, they were showing a different heart and a different conscience. And it would prick the conscience of the white Southerner. Not all of them, but enough. The ones that are sitting on the sidelines and haven't quite made up their mind or doesn't have, they would say, I can't stand how we're mistreating the 84-year-old grandmothers by sicking snarling dogs on them. And he says the idea is that we're building conscience, not only on the African American, but also in the whites, so they can become a human being, a real human being, and to know God more. So he and his fellow pastors in Montgomery, Alabama, taught African Americans how to respond to insult and attacks in a way that showed not anger and fighting. By the way, one of his parishioners said we should go out and kill 8 or 10 white people and then they will leave us alone. And then Martin Luther King says that's not what we're going to do. So that doesn't show we have much of a soul, does it? It shows that we can be just as heartless as anybody else. So what they did is there was a big strike over the bus system because Rosa Parks was denied a seat that was reserved for whites, which was in front of the bus. And she was fined $14. So they decided to fight that. That became a very important part of the civil rights movement. And they wanted to make sure, though, that they reveal hearts that would also reveal hearts on the other side that they were mistreating good people. So they would put chairs in front of the altars of every church that were like bus aisles. And they would sit down the people that were going to be, testing, the racism, the discrimination on the buses or to demonstrate. Mm-hmm. And they would test them by having people come up before the altar of the churches, insult them and spit on them and stuff like that. And sometimes people wanted to hit back and actually sock one of the pastors. But they trained their people to say, we want you to reveal the best part of your heart. And by doing that, and when they did get beaten, when they did get dogs sucked on them, there were a number of whites that then felt conscience stricken. And the South started to change. The African Americans got dignity in their hearts, and some whites got a conscience that they had to serve God in a different way. That's just an unknown little theme in the civil rights movement, that creating conscience and revealing consciences was actually an important method of the civil rights movement in order to win civil rights for African Americans. So let's stop for questions and be happy to take some or comments. Or if I'm maybe not clear about this, I can expand on that.
Very good. Maybe I'll ask the first question, and if other people, while I'm asking, can think of something, that'll be very good. I enjoyed hearing about the Brooklyn influence, particularly most of us here are in Brooklyn, New York, right. Queens also, where my wife's family is from. Why did he go south? Did he feel he would have more of an impact in the South? Did he feel that in the South, his work was needed there more than it was needed, in other areas of the United States? What was the impetus to go south?
There were at least two reasons. He and his wife, talked about where they would move to. Now, by the way, the family was not totally happy with Coretta because she was not from Georgia. She was from Alabama, which they didn't like too much. But that's one reason they moved, is that Coretta's family network was down there. But more importantly, they said, yes, we were invited to pastor at 2 churches in New York City. That was actually could have been one. He could have come from New York. And Concord wanted him, and Friendship Baptist Church, and there probably were some others. But they felt like that the South was changing. That after the war, after Depression, after the war, the South was beginning to change. And it was, if somebody could be on the ground floor to sort of appeal to conscience and say that our conscience should guide us, that they could create a new South. And they could create what King called a new Negro. That is a Negro that felt self-confident and felt loved and felt dignity, and a new white of the South, and a new South. Mm-hmm. So they thought they wanted to be part of that change and could accelerate it. And so they went to Dexter Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And of course, that's where the first big conflict with Rosa Parks getting, she wanted to sit in the front of the bus, and that was the white area, and they took her off, and there was a big fight over that. He also felt like if we can't win in the South, we really can't change the African-American world, because most African Americans still were in the South. So those are the reasons. It was it was hard. The Coretta was not used to, she had been going to school in Boston, so she was not used to, you go into a Black neighborhood, you can only shop in Black stores, you could only, go to the upstairs at a theater. You couldn't be on the main floor, you could only be in the balcony. I mean, that was alien to her, and it took her a little while to get used to it. But they felt like they had to, the change was going to come in the South, and they wanted to be part of that.
Right. So it was practical as well as ideological reasons, but there was also interesting, the practical, the backstory that people may not know. It's interesting to hear that.
Most of King's, if you'll see most of King's writings, they're very practical, because he was a nuts and bolts guy, and they were building a movement from the ground up, and it took up, and it was they had so many challenges. For example, they decided to strike and not ride the buses, and they would almost all the taxi cabs were driven by African Americans, so they volunteered to take people to work, so people wouldn't have to take a bus. Then the city council said, well, we're going to fine anybody, because they're trying to operate a limousine service, and that's not approved by the city. So we're going to fine every cab driver that takes anybody. So they had to organize their own sort of private cars. It was one constant thing after another. And
struggle, sure. Wow. Does anybody have any questions you want to ask? By the way, there's a beautiful story about a little old lady who was walking miles every day. You probably heard it, and it relates to what you were talking about. And Dr. King said, you could take the bus. We'll make an exception for you, even though we're boycotting the bus system. You could take the bus. And she said, my feet may be tired, but my soul is rested. So it goes, to what you were saying about the soul, which is very, very interesting. Adina, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, just excuse my video's not on because I'm having some technical difficulties with my phone. I guess I have a comment and a follow-up question. I just found it very interesting that the discussion between Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel was around, God's hiddenness, particularly from a Jewish perspective, because this was already the post-Holocaust era, and I think that was very much prevalent in a lot of Jewish thinkers' minds, like where was God? And it's interesting how, Heschel kind of, in his, it sounds like in his discussion with King, they kind of have tried to develop, a framework for understanding it. I think, and I believe even when he spoke about the Holocaust, he basically would respond whenever anybody would ask where was God. His answer was, the question's not where was God, it was where was man. So it's interesting how this all kind of comes together. And my question is a practical one. Are these minutes of their meeting recorded, or where can you find the record of that?
Between Heschel and King, yes, there is some record of it. Stanford has an archives. They've collected a lot of this material. And I believe there is a record of that meeting in the Stanford King archives.
Oh.
And they also have Heschel's, there was a panel discussion on race and religion. And that's where King was there and Heschel was there, Rabbi Heschel was there. And that's where they connected at that point. Yeah, I think that you could find that some of that material in the Stanford archives, and some of that you can download. It's in PDF form, so forth.
Very interesting. Other questions? Anybody else want to take a crack at what we're talking about, or anything else you may want to ask Tony? Anything? Let me just see the chat. Louis, did you want to, you have anything to say or you want to ask? I saw you put some stuff on the chat.
Excellent. Yes.
Yeah. So definitely very interesting. One of the things I would ask also, we talk about conscience, which I think is a very important subject. You know, then it goes to show you Dr. King was a great visionary. Has anyone, you know, who may have had these, say, racist or bigoted feelings, anybody prominent, ever changed their view as a result of Dr. King's attitude?
Well, yeah, there have been quite a few, sometimes after his death. And also that's a challenge for each of us. We have such a tumultuous, raucous conversation in America today. We should always ask ourselves, are we really building the other person's heart in our conversation? Are we building their conscience? We're building something inside somebody that even if we disagree with them, that there's something's happening inside that we are sensitive to and we want to help with. Now, King was aware of that. And there were a number of momentous shifts. One very famous one was George Wallace. As you know, George Wallace was governor of Alabama, a total opponent of King, segregation forever type of guy. But after King got shot, Wallace also got shot. And he started thinking more seriously about that. He had he had called himself a Christian, but he really wasn't. He was just a politician, really. And he thought that he had betrayed he had lost his bearing, he had lost his way. And he actually had a spiritual experience and rejected his former racist stances and past. Now, why is this important? Well, of course, and he said, you know, King was right. And why is this important? Well, nobody would have expected George Wallace to change. He was pretty tough, and the people around him were very mean. I had, as a young college student, I was sent to meet with some of his aides and I met with them in New Orleans, and I met with them because nobody wanted to have to admit that they met with George Wallace and his aides, and so they sent a young college student who could always be denied, say he did something that nobody approved of. But I didn't know what I was going to do, and they were pretty. I could definitely see axe handles in their hands. They were a pretty mean group. I did not meet Wallace, but he did not come. But in fact, the Wallace, it changed, and he said, I see that what King is doing, he's opening hearts, and he opens minds. So that was a pretty significant change, since he was he ran for president on the segregationist platform and got a lot of votes in the South, a lot of states of the South, and yet he had that change. There are some others, people that were killers that changed their mind, but King said that you're not going to win everybody. Some people are just not, they're just hardened their hearts so much that they no longer respond to conscience. But he said, what you find in a town like Montgomery, you found a lot of quiet whites that are sitting on, they sort of think, blacks are given a bad deal, or they're sitting on the sideline, or they are casual racist, but they're not so embedded. And those people, he felt that he could reach. Now, he was often frustrated. He wanted to reach white pastors, and several of them and businessmen reached out. He thought he could reach them because he would provoke their conscience. But the penalty of supporting King was so high, many of them were afraid, and he was disappointed in that. You find that certain businesses, corporations like Coca-Cola, decide they want a new South. You found people like Jimmy Carter. An often untold story about Jimmy Carter is that the first time he ran for governor, he lost because the guy against him was more racist. And so he got elected. So Jimmy Carter, the second time around, he decided he would be as racist as anybody. But as you know, that really didn't set well inside himself. And he was a big fan of Martin Luther King, and that expediency was it was uncomfortable. In order to get elected in governor of Georgia, he had to do certain things like that, and that. But at all the time he's doing that, he's got this guilty conscience, and of course it pushed him in a direction away from that. But so it's not always 100%, or sometimes it's zigzag effect, and sometimes it's dramatic.
Right.
And many people many people had a hard time that King was doing what was illegal. He was sitting in, or he was sitting in the hallway, or blocking doors or stuff like that. And so it was hard for some Southern whites to say, well, I like what he's doing, but I can't, he's doing it all in illegal ways. But what King was saying is that you had to place yourself in like sitting in a hallway or something,
Right.
in a sit-in, but you had to take the punishment of doing that, as you didn't fight back. And by doing that, people would at first feel a little disturbed by that you're doing it. And then when the overreaction set in, they were more disturbed by that. They were sitting in, you should find them or something, but you shouldn't go and have dogs sicked on them and hit them with fire hoses. And the 84-year-old grandmother is, bounces her head on the concrete pavement.
I just want to read the chat here. So Lewis put in, it was very interesting. This is what you said is, it's actually shocking, but I thank you for that information about Wallace, because he really served as the symbol of, the quintessential bigot. Here, Lewis put this in. Wallace lost his first election to an ardent segregationist. He vowed that from now on, no one was going to out-N him. The N obviously being the inevitable N word. That's really amazing, what kind of impact King's methodology had on somebody like George Wallace. And that's not well known, but I think more people should really know about that, because it shows you, when you appeal to conscience, what kind of progress you might make. It's a very, very fascinating thing.
And it's an unusual public strategy, political strategy, and it's an unusual evangelism strategy. It's an unusual that if America is secularizing, then the way to go it back is to go back to conscience.
Right.
And so they had a theory, as somebody said earlier, Rabbi Heschel had to deal with this awful destruction of the Jewish community in Germany and Poland and similar places. And
Right.
how do you keep the heart alive in those situations? How do you keep God alive in those situations? And he said, well, you have to go and realize that conscience.
Right.
And there's quite a few actually psychological studies of showing that there's some validity. As you know, Viktor Frankl studied Jews who were in concentration camps, and he found those who were the most kind to other prisoners were the ones that last the longest. And
Interesting.
And that fared better as human beings.
Yeah, a lot of famous stories about that. By the way, we promised people that we'd be done by 9. So we have time for, I think, 2 more questions. Anybody want to take a crack at a question or comment or anything of that nature?
It was a great meeting, Rabbi. It was a great meeting.
Thank you. One more question I would ask is the following. I think we actually discussed this the other day. I don't know if you have information. If not, it's okay too. The impact that King had on religious leaders and on religious denominations fighting for civil rights. Now, I know one of the things in his lifetime was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and many Jewish leaders supported it. I do know that within the Catholic Church, there was a big debate as to whether the church as a whole should support it. And it turns out in the end, they did, even those churches that did not, that weren't crazy about it. Now, ended up supporting. By the way, 1964 Civil Rights Act was very, very important because it guaranteed, the civil liberties and equal rights for everybody, including white people. White people, Black people, everybody had to have civil rights. So it was something very important. Do you feel that King influenced the broad support in the religious communities for the 1964 Civil Rights Act?
Well, I think he did. I would use an example from Brooklyn. As you know, in 1957, Billy Graham was invited by the New York Council of Churches to come and do his crusades here, his evangelism meetings. But one of the underreported meetings was his street meeting in front of Cornerstone Baptist Church with Reverend Sandy Ray introducing him. And he made a famous sermon or a talk saying that, if you're racist, you probably can't be saved. And then he invited Martin Luther King to come and speak at the Madison Square Garden meeting. And that was a very important moment for the evangelicals of the United States, because there are many evangelicals in the South, but also in the North. And King made that reach out and spoke at the Billy Graham meeting, and they became a sort of a coalition, a powerful coalition. And in his talk, Reverend Graham said that I also support federal civil rights legislation. So there was now, there were lots of reasons that Graham came to that, but certainly Martin Luther King's stature as a man of conscience affected people like Graham to
Mhm.
to announce their changes in Brooklyn. And so even there, you get to see, just not all that far away in mid Brooklyn, how that change took place. And there were many other changes. You mentioned the Catholic Church, and you've got changes that, and there was a change also in the churches also felt like they needed to expand their hearts. That
Right.
was a message that that came through. The Council of Churches in 1957 said, religion is dying in New York, and it wasn't really dying, but they were alarmed by some trends. And because the 50s religion often was not real deep, and there was lots of movement, beginning to be movement out to the suburbs, in the Jewish community also. So they said,
Similarly in the Jewish, absolutely, that's right.
Yeah, well, you get you get lots of wondering, why Margaret saying in a children's book, are you there, God?
Right.
And so
Yeah,
there was changes up and down the line.
nice. I just wanted to turn to the chat. Steve Elworth, my friend, points out that John Patterson, who died last year at the age of 99, was the governor before Wallace. He endorsed Barack Obama for president in 2008. Very interesting.
Amazing. I didn't know that. Yeah.
That's
Judy
very,
Blume.
very interesting fact. Wow. And then I have Lewis Kessler says Goldwater's manifesto was called Conscious of a Conservative.
Well, no, it wasn't conscious. He was right. He just mistyped it. It was Conscience of a Conservative. And Barry Goldwater was a Jewish. The Goldwaters owned the biggest department store in, I believe it's Phoenix, and they were the first to integrate, to hire and to integrate African Americans into the store.
Huh, wow.
Yeah.
Very nice. Speaking of conscience, I want to mention another rabbi who was very well known, especially in New York City. That was the Grand Rabbi of Lubavitch, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, Lubavitcher rabbi. And I want to tell you, in 1991, after the Crown Heights riots, David Dinkins, who was then the mayor of New York City, asked Dinkins, the first Black mayor of New York City, he asked the Rebbe for a blessing of peace between the Jewish community and the Black community. And he responded, the Rebbe, responded, I cannot give such a blessing. Jews and Blacks are not two separate communities. We are not two separate peoples. We are all one people under one administration and under one God. Those were the words of the Lubavitcher rabbi. So it was very, certainly appealing to conscience in a very, very profound way.
And it was very King-like. King would always emphasize that if African Americans get ahead, we also want white Americans to get ahead, because we're all part of the same great brotherhood.
Well, I'm not going out now.
I didn't even know.
All right, it looks like, okay. It looks like we have, all right, let me just, okay.
And you're right. I was talking, Are You There, God? It's Margaret. That's Judy Blume's series. And that's the name of her first, her big hit. And she wrote a whole bunch of books. But it was all about, moving out to the suburbs and then all of a sudden not really knowing what one believed. And she's still sort of searching. She lives down in Miami now, down in Florida now. And is somebody I'd like to reach out to, how she would write the book now. But
right. By the way, as we wish each other a happy Tu B'Shvat and a happy Martin Luther King Day, I want to tell you the website is nycreligion.info, and you can find more about the Tu B'Shvat as well as Martin Luther King Day. How it's related on Tony's website. This was a very, very informative talk. And we really appreciate you speaking to our congregation and beyond. Many, many people, joined us from all parts of the world. And even, by the way, we had somebody from California joining. So,
Rabbi Segal, thank you very much for giving me the space and your leadership and asking me questions as we went before. It was so well appreciated. Thank you very much, all of you.
oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. So happy to have you, and thank you so much. I'll put the website on the chat.
And if anybody has any questions or comments or ideas, just send me an email. It's editor@nycreligion.info. editor@nycreligion.info, and be happy to hear from you, whatever you want to talk about.
Beautiful. Yeah, I put that on the chat. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us, and wish you a good evening.